Thank you everybody for joining us. This is the Proto-OKN webinar series, and where it's hosted by the Proto-OKN teams and the Educate team, which is the education gateway to everything about the Prototype Open Knowledge Network and the related knowledge graphs. And we're super excited to have Jen Hammock presenting today. Jen and I met recently at another data-related workshop on biodiversity data, and we were really enthralled learning about the Encyclopedia of Life. And so Jen is at the Smithsonian Institution and the National Museum of Natural History, and she'll be presenting today on species-level trait data in a graph. And I think it's wonderful from many perspectives because she thinks about graph data, knowledge graphs, and knowledge networks all the time, and we all do too. And so it's like we were two orbs that hadn't been spending time together. So we're hoping that this opens up new insights, knowledge, and potentially new collaborations. So Jen, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. I have very little access to peer groups, so anytime I can compare notes with other graph data people is to be treasured. So I'm really looking forward to discussing my problems with you and your problems and anything else that comes up. This is the kind of data that I've been integrating for about 12 years. I specialize in trait and other attribute data, characteristics of organisms, which are meant to be representative at the species level. And if anyone thinks representative at the species level sounds a bit fraught, yeah, I was expecting this crowd to be the sort of group that would notice that. Don't worry, we'll get into it. This work takes place in the context of a project called the Encyclopedia of Life. It's been going for almost 20 years now. Our interest has always been in information at the level of species, not just traits. We started with things like images and narrative text information. And we were tasked with informing people about all the species on Earth. So what we ended up with at this point is pretty good coverage for a handful of things for multicellular organisms and some scattered coverage for microbes. Everything that we host is reusable, either in the public domain or under a Creative Commons license. And we created none of it. It's all integrated from existing sources around the world. And because of this, we prize and work hard on provenance, attribution information. This is attached to data in EOL at the level of the individual record. We don't anticipate our users will necessarily take chunks of information out of our database in the same chunks that they arrived. So data set level metadata is not useful to our users. So everything, the citation instructions, the link back to the source, that kind of information is attached to each record individually. And yes, it creates some redundancy in the database. The same is actually true for contextual metadata. We'll talk about that later too. In addition, we prize many of the same things you value, I'm sure: discoverability, interoperability, and portability, which is why we like structure in our data. And for accessibility, we address this first and foremost by providing a bunch of ways for people to access the data. We'll take a quick look at those at the end. We were inspired early in this adventure by this figure, which was published in a couple of publications by Rod Page, who is a member of the biodiversity informatics community, who has always been good at nudging us all to be our best selves. This looks like a lot of work, which will take a village, and we figured we could contribute here because there is a fair amount of pretty well structured, or at least tabulated, trait and attribute data at the occurrence level, so an individual organism. But that gap is going to be so gappy for so long. We thought that was a good place to try and put some kind of summarized information. So at the species level type, trait data might play a role somewhat similar to the fabric in the Proto-OKN, as the intersection of the bus that brings these neighborhoods a little bit closer to each other. So we envision this sort of discovery mechanism as search facets reaching into the sum of human knowledge about biodiversity. One well-developed search facet already existed before we came along: the taxonomic classification of life on Earth. Although it's continuously under construction, is Community supported, pretty stable and well agreed upon, and very granular. If you know something about the ancestry of the organism that you're interested in, you can use that to narrow down a search pretty well through all of biodiversity knowledge. But if that's not what you know, or if in addition you know other things about the organism, it would be nice if there were other search facets that you could leverage in order to target the information that you're looking for. A couple of them are actually pretty easy to get good coverage on pretty fast. So we've made good progress in that regard with broad categorizations of habitat and geography, where something lives, what kind of environment it lives in. And we're working on a bunch of others that we think are going to be useful for searchers. We started with low-hanging fruit, and so we're sort of pushing these along as best we can. Our goals for discoverability and also for interoperability, because we assume people will be taking data from our database and trying to make use of it in some other context. So we want it to play well with other data. Both of those things, as you all are aware, impose requirements about vocabulary and identifiers. So here's where we are. A lot of humans come to us with questions in their own words. And we may have records, lots of records, that match their desire and have no words in common with the words in their question. So we feel like our system needs to be able to bridge this gap. Something in EOL needs to know that the word ovigerous, bearing of eggs, like pregnant, implies adult, that moths include the genus Caristonura, that dry mass is a kind of body size, that woodlands include boreal coniferous forest, and that the Hudson Bay lowlands are found in Ontario. So we decided to handle this very directly by terms relationships. This can entail a lot of work. We have so far encountered 113 different terms describing measures of size, but they're not that hard to organize into a classification. So wet body mass is a kind of body mass, which is a subcategory of mass, which is a measure of size, and so on. So we can get these organized so that if you're looking for something specific, you can find it. Size is actually unusual for a predicate in having this large vocabulary. Most predicates, things that describe, say, trophic ecology, what things eat, have only a few different terms. So trophic guild, trophic level, and diet cover most of the data of that kind that come in. But if you include the terms for the values, and you don't have to be able to read the words on this, don't worry, it's just the shape that I wanted you to see. The values of the trophic ecology terms, things like sanguivore, bloodsucker, filter feeder, carnivore, piercing/sucking, all of that vocabulary, it would be nice if we connected it together. This is the napkin sketch that was made by my colleague Katja Schultz when she and I were trying to figure out the relationships between all the terms in this space. And as you can see, we got them all to connect. But sometimes it's sort of not obvious. You can think of the relationships like this as superclass, subclass. We colloquially call them parent-child. But sometimes it's just an implication, right? So functionally, the requirement is that if you're looking for X, should that include Y? In that case, Y should be a child or a descendant, could be several children down. So that's the mechanism by which we wanted to get to this bouquet of hierarchical search facets for drilling down into biodiversity knowledge. This sketch is lying about one thing. It implies that it's a strictly single parent hierarchy in every case. That's only true for the taxonomic classification. For the terms, the superclass and subclass stuff, you've probably run into this. It's not strictly single parent. Egg-bearing or ovigerous does imply adult, but it also implies female. Canada is found in the Western Hemisphere and the Northern Hemisphere. So most of our data terms have multiple parents. We were very lucky that most of the entities and concepts and classes that we needed to be able to identify were available in existing vocabulary products. We rely heavily on Wikidata, the Obo Foundry ontologies, which are a mostly biodiversity and ecology community, and a couple of well-known global gazetteers. The data terms all exist in EOL in the form of their uniform resource identifiers. which have lots of nice properties. They're unique. We hope for a while, will point to informative web pages that indicate their label and definition in relationship to other terms. Our taxonomic identifiers, those of you who work with biotic information will be familiar with the providers. There are some major classification providers out there, and we use a few of them. There are supposed to be many that cover all life, but no single one of those met all our needs, so we have a bit of a Frankenstein solution going on for taxonomic classification. We'll take a quick look at it later. There are about 3,000 terms in our vocabulary, mostly value terms with a couple hundred predicate terms, many of which are measures of size. And the classification is about 3/4 from the Catalog of Life, which is the largest available taxonomy provider. And where we didn't like it or we felt it didn't meet our needs, we spliced in branches from other classifications, and that trickles down to there are places where there was trouble and there was no single source solution, and that's where we have something called a patch. My colleague Katja Schultz is in charge of this too, and a patch is basically a homework exercise she gives herself, where she reads the literature and pulls out everything that she needs in order to make any edits that are needed. And our needs for the hierarchy are just to have some place to put trait data. So if we don't have, wherever we don't have trait data, we don't care. But this works reasonably well, but does take a lot of effort. It's surprising how much effort it sometimes takes to use somebody else's product. I think I've mentioned that we have a wide variety of different user types, and that means we get a wide variety of different kinds of questions. Large-scale, multivariate, sophisticated research questions like this do not faze us at all. It's all about the kind of user. Users like these know exactly what they want. They find it very easily in a well-organized database, and they know how to transform it if they need to do whatever it is they want downstream. So this doesn't make our work any more difficult. The kind of question that makes us scratch our heads and question our life choices are these. And many, many, many humans have questions like this. And if you give them a response like this doesn't even necessarily answer their question. You don't know if this answers their question. This is just a sample of complexity with which you can support your request that they please be a little bit more specific. And some of this complexity we've already addressed, right? Different kinds of bears are in the taxonomic classification. That's organized. Different measures of size, similarly, it can be managed with terms relationships. But there's another layer of complexity that you get with individual measurements and observations about biodiversity, because it's never the whole species. It's always an individual. And sometimes if, as we are, you're trying to make representative of the species assertions, there are important caveats that need to be mentioned when you share information. Life stage is a big one, especially for measures of things like size, but it can also be important for habitat and behavior. So sex and life stage, if you have a quantitative measure to report, it's useless unless you say what unit it's in. And there are probably a few other metrics that are important, like what kind of statistical method is it? A maximum measurement is a very different thing from an average measurement. So buckle up. I was told that you all would be interested in looking at our data model. Given the complexity that we were trying to manage, this is what we came up with. We use Neo4j, which is a property graph product. So we have entities, and the entities can have properties. In this sketch, the rounded bubbles are entities. We've discussed the taxon, or species, let's say, which we know has to be an entity because it's got to be related to other taxa. The measurement types, size, circadian rhythm, that sort of thing, and the measurement value also need to be entities so they can be related to other terms. So none of these is the relationship, but these three things need to meet somewhere. So this is what we came up with. We have an entity called a data record, from which, if you start there, you can get to all the information about a reported fact. So the data record is also where we store any of the important contextual and attribution data. So there's a limited set of properties that are available to a data record. The common metadata, sex and life stage, are in there. A lot of provenance information is available because people report provenance in different ways. But for example, bibliographic citation. So in that case, it's a long text field. Sex and life stage, that kind of sort of well understood metadata. We use terms with identifiers in there. And there can also be numerical values. A record which is a quantitative attribute will look similar, but it will probably require a few more properties to make clear the meaning of the value because the value is a number. And since the value is a number, it doesn't need to be an entity. It doesn't have to be connected to anything else. So that is also a property. Some of you will have noticed the purple bubble and the bottom ominously labeled metadata. Because we have a limited set of properties available on a data record, and because some data always comes along with additional information on it that doesn't fit the fields that you have, this is how we handle it. A metadata node behaves much like a record. It needs a measurement type, it needs a measurement value. So basically, this one is saying, look, when we measured that metabolism or whatever it was, the water temperature was 2 degrees. So it needs to say what it says. So if it were a property, the measurement type would be the property field and the value would be the value. But sometimes we also actually need additional metadata on this because the value is 2, but it has a unit. So that's why we stick this in an additional entity. These are meant to be rare. Anything that was common, we tried to provide for in the properties on the data record. There are more of them than I would like, but this is how we grow. So ignoring all of that complexity for the rest of the talk, I'm just going to use this shorthand to give you an idea what kind of information we have. We have some anatomical information, just descriptions of what organisms look like. We have a lot more functional ecology type information, primarily trophic ecology stuff and habitat assignments. And we also have quite a lot of ecological relationships, predator-prey, host-parasite, thanks to our data partner, Global Biotic Interactions, which is another great open source biodiversity data project. Yes, this kind of data does require a bit more data model. It's nothing very surprising. It's pretty much what you'd expect. And we can talk about it later if you want. These, which are not traits, anthropogenic categories, management, economic roles, that kind of thing. These are handled exactly like biotic traits in our model. We tend to find they require about the same structure of data. Since we're trying for enabling search, we don't really want a little bit of this data type and a little bit of that. That's just an invitation for someone to search and get a lot of false negatives. So our goal is to get adequate coverage for any of our important data categories. So we're trying to push this graph up before we make it wider. Not every data category applies to everybody. Not every organism meaningfully has a growth habit. That's for sponges and plants mostly. So 400,000 of those might be pretty good, actually. But everybody has a habitat. So we have less than 1 million habitat, species covered for habitat. We need to do some more work over there. So this is where we are. I'm going to show you a few of the front ends that we offer. Our varied user base, because it shows off some of the utility about just having structure in your data, some of the advantages of that. Structured data works great for humans to read. You can make nice tables out of it. You can make little bits of natural language out of structured data very easily. You don't need AI. You can just do it with a template and have full control over it. So we have a web interface with species pages, and we populate it with this stuff. We do make all the gory details available on the website. You do have to click on something to get the gory details, and we believe that most of our visitors do not, but it's available if they want to do their homework. At the other end of the spectrum, you can query the graph from our Cypher endpoint arbitrarily. So any Cypher query will work here as long as it doesn't time out. So the common sort of thing that people tend to ask is, this is my species of interest. This is the attribute that I want to know. Tell me the value. That's very common. Not everybody is handy with Cypher. So we did create a flattened version of the data a very wide, sparse table. Some assembly required. It's actually in several files, which is downloadable on Zenodo, and many users do prefer this. The interface that is the most like my fantasy of the search facets into the cloud of knowledge is on the website. It's available to humans. It's just a faceted search. You can use one taxonomic facet and any number of trait facets, which can have the attribute, the predicate and the value, or just one or the other. And you can layer those. So you can specify that you want frugivore and you can specify that you want nocturnal. You didn't have to say trophic yield. You didn't have to say behavioral circadian rhythm. Although that doesn't usually change anything. And you can narrow this down to mammals or something if you want. You can ask it for a list of species, or you can ask it for the records underlying that response. Because the data are nicely structured, we can do a lot of scaffolding for people to narrow down their search, especially if they weren't sure initially what they were looking for. Once you have the habitat data for orchids, we can show you a summary of, well, here are the values that show up a lot, and you can say, oh, well, actually, woodland, that's the habitat of orchids that interests me, and then you can narrow it down further, and you can just keep drilling down through this interface. And if at any point, if you do have a taxonomic angle and you want to narrow by that instead, you can do that. That interface is also available from the search page. So that helps us to make access a little easier for people who don't have real data tools and are just relying on their human web habits. This is probably my favorite data visualization. It's not so much for searching as for browsing. This is the Trophic web browser. It brings a sample of ecologically related species for, say, the Christmas tree worm. We bring you a sample of organisms that feed on it, organisms that it feeds on, and other organisms that feed on the same prey, so potential competitors in its landscape. It's not complete because you can't fit everything on a screen all the time, but you can interact with it. You can select one of these neighbors and bring it to the center and summon its entourage and just crawl your way through the web of trophic interactions in the world. So we also benefit from structure in scaling the bringing in the integration of new data. Taxonomic inference is probably familiar to some of you on the biological side and may resemble things that others of you in other spheres use, inference in general. I'm curious about that. If I say branch painting, I mean the same thing. Basically, what this means is if you know of a conserved attribute, like a generalization, comb jellies have habitat pelagic. That's sweeping. Great. If you know the structure of the taxonomic classification, you can very easily create a record that says they're pelagic and attach it to the comb jellies taxon and then all its descendants. Very easy. You have to be careful because this is a comb jelly too. It's not pelagic. It likes to crawl around on benthic organisms. But that's not so hard. You can just create an instruction in the same data record, say, paint it down to all the comb jellies except for this one and all its descendants. This can get pretty complicated. I don't know if any of you are familiar with ghost pipe. It's pretty common in our region. It's a parasitic plant. It does not have photosynthesis. So if, like me, you wanted to assign a trophic yield to all plants, it'd be very tempting to say, oh, it's photoautotrophic. It feeds itself through photosynthesis. And you can create a record that says, all plants are photoautotrophic except for these 660 clades that lost photosynthesis. This works. We did it. It's fine. And then a separate data set assigns parasitic to those 660 other clades and their descendants. This is very traditional in biology. 130 years ago, people were thinking about the inheritance of attributes this way. This is that comb jelly example. Free swimming phylum of organisms, except for this creeping form in the benthos. This is how we organize our information. Speaking of the biological literature, we do have a lot of data coming in lately from that source of text. It's a very rich repository of biodiversity knowledge. We did hundreds of years reporting that way. So now getting the data out is important. Um, we do use machines. We only use transparent, deterministic automated methods, but we do natural language processing to access this information in literature sources. The main sources we use are the typical open access ones that are out there. There's a compilation of species description called Treatment Bank, which is from a wide range of literature. The Biodiversity Heritage Library is probably familiar to many of you. And the Smithsonian Institution, as a federally funded research body, requires all of its federally funded research to be published open access, and a lot of it is organized into something called the Smithsonian Contributions. So these are easily accessed bundles of text that we can mine. We use something called the Global Names Architecture. We have for, I think, 10 years now of dabbling in text mining. I was only in on it at the very beginning, but they're still using the GNA. That is an ongoing project, and it's really, really good. We started out detecting vocabulary terms. So things from the Obo Foundry or any other vocabulary you want to use, you can load your vocabulary in and put it in this tool that which is called the Pensoft Annotator. We don't use the Pensoft Annotator anymore. We found that we had specific needs, and our own garage code meets those needs better. But the PA was a really nice on-ramp into detecting ontology terms in text. So the pipeline goes something like this. You feed in the document, and it pulls out, based on semantic relationships between the relevant terms, the taxa and the data terms, candidate facts. And then you filter out a lot of things: negative assertions, vague or uncertain assertions, anything where a homonym might be an issue. And you throw that away, and then you construct trait records from the results. And then, if you are Katja Schultz, who is in charge of this right now, you go through a very long process of iterative manual quality control. And you feed the rules that you come up with back upstream, and you go through this a few times until you get quite a clean output. She's been working on this for a couple of years now with my colleague Eli Agbayani, who does the code for this part. And so they are currently using the NLP engine Spacey. And again, no AI, just natural language processing. We are embedded at the Smithsonian, so we like to use Smithsonian resources whenever possible, and they do have a lot of nice open resources. So in addition to the Smithsonian contributions, which were a source of a lot of our early text mining data records, one thing we're hoping to turn to next is traits extracted from photos of museum specimens, which is a rich source of this kind of data, which the technology is just converging now. You keep thinking we're ready, and then it gets easier. The digitization of this information, and also the machine vision tools available for analyzing it, just keep getting better. But pretty soon we're just going to have to jump into this pool, because there's a lot of data available, in particular measures of size, which is in very high demand for organisms that don't have it available for from other sources, like marine invertebrates. Thank you so much for listening. I hope I have made you able to understand my life and my problems, and I look forward to hearing how they compare with yours.
Everybody says thank you, Jen.
Thank you for having me. This was good fun.
It was a lot of fun. Thank you so much. Take care, everyone, and stay safe.